Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my fantasy defense draft strategy going into the 2020 fantasy football season and answering the question that's just right above me. What defines a successful fantasy defense going into the 2020 fantasy football season? We'll cover that. We'll talk about the different variables and metrics that we can cover to potentially predict this upcoming's best overall defense and the #1 overall defense. And as you can see from the thumbnail, I'm leaning in a specific direction, but we'll talk about how I got there, the different breakdowns, and the different statistics that back that thought process. Now, before we begin, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support. We're almost at 15K subscribers. If you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel, join the community. We'll be creating fantasy football content here for the entirety of the 2020 season. Don't forget to also click the bell notification button down below. Just notifies you when my latest video is out for those of you who are trying to stay up to date. Either way, thank you guys for the incredible support. I really cannot thank you guys enough. All right, like I was mentioning, what defines a successful fantasy defense? I mean, a lot of us have abolished the defensive position and or the kicker position in our respective leagues, especially for those of us who are playing in high-stake leagues. You don't really want that extra random aspect kind of tacked on at the end of every week that could potentially lose you a week because, you know, the opposing team that's playing against you has a defense that gets 3 pick sixes just randomly, right? And those things are just unpredictable at times, especially with those kind of touchdown metrics. But regardless, I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to figure out what defines a successful fantasy defense. And I kind of broke it down to a couple different contributing factors. Is it the consistency? Is it the amount of points allowed for that defense? Because again, every defense in fantasy football typically starts with 10 points. And as an offense scores on them, that 10-point, placeholder begins to wither down. Is it yards allowed? Is it forced turnovers? Is it quarterback sacks? Or is it touchdowns? Or is it a culmination of all? We'll talk about that. We'll see what teams are pretty much leading the pack in every single one of these statistics to kind of help us get a better understanding of who are the best fantasy defenses going into this upcoming season and who you should potentially be drafting in your upcoming drafts. Now, again, I talked about consistency, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up a consistency chart here. I'll kind of move out of the way a little bit. Here's the thing about consistency. Last season, this was the top 12 fantasy defenses in regular formats. The New England Patriots, obviously, like we all remember, were just unstoppable from the first 8 weeks of the season. They had a very easy strength of schedule. And in that, I mean, they played against some bum quarterbacks. And boy, did they score a lot of points. And boy, did they win a lot of games for fantasy owners. But regardless, this is the breakdown from 1 through 12. At this current juncture, I don't expect the New England Patriots to repeat that kind of a season. That's one of the best defensive fantasy seasons I've ever seen. I mean, that was better than, I think, the RB8 in fantasy? I don't even think the number 8 RB put up that many points last season in comparison to the New England Patriots defense. So again, these are numbers that are, pretty out there. But again, if you can go ahead and find a defense like that and have them on your roster and they're going to contribute that many points a week, over 10 points a week, that's a huge determining factor to your ultimate success in fantasy. And it's just an extra way to get you over the edge on a weekly basis. Now, when we're talking about consistency, on the very right of this chart next to the fantasy points from 2019, I have a number that's pretty much kind of showing you over the last 5 years how many seasons this defense has been a top 12 defense. So the New England Patriots have been a top 5 defense in 4 out of the last 5 seasons, while the Pittsburgh Steelers 2 out of the last 3. And if there's a team that's been given the 1 out of 1, it's because they've been extremely inconsistent and there's been like a 3-year gap in between the last time they were a top 12 defense, like the 49ers themselves. But otherwise, the couple defenses that we want to go ahead and look at: the New England Patriots, extremely consistent. The Baltimore Ravens, always in the conversation for sure, 4 out of the last 5 seasons. The Los Angeles Rams in that conversation. The Kansas City Chiefs have been a top 12 fantasy defense in 5 out of the last 5 seasons. That is, I mean, when I was just breaking it down, I was like, how is this even possible? It's just, it's crazy to think about. The Minnesota Vikings, 4 out of the last 5, and then we got the New Orleans Saints pretty much on the same page as the Pittsburgh Steelers. But ultimately, I look at this consistency chart and I think, okay, if we can go ahead and at least lock down the Patriots, the Ravens, the Rams, Chiefs, the Vikings, these are defenses that on a yearly basis are always in this top 12 conversation. If you're going to be in this top 12 conversation, you're most likely going to be in the middle of the pack because you're always one of those top upper echelon defenses with defensive, minded teams and players that are going to produce on a yearly basis. But there's also other teams and there's also other factors. So once we get past consistency, let's talk about points allowed. Last season, these were the best teams in terms of allowing points to opposing offenses on a weekly basis. New England Patriots were number 1, and the Tennessee Titans closed out the top 12 at number 12 with 20.7 points allowed per game. Now, if they were given that little green highlight, that means that they were a top 12 defense in terms of overall fantasy performance last season. So as you can see on screen, we have 8 of the top 12 defenses leading in the department of points allowed. Right there's a little bit of a correlation, kind of thinking to myself, all right, we have some of the best defenses and they're not allowing many points. For the teams that aren't allowing many points and still not being able to get over the hump in terms of fantasy productivity at the defensive position is probably because of other factors. They're not maybe scoring enough touchdowns or causing enough turnovers or getting enough quarterback sacks. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it is good to see that the defenses that are within this consistent range, the Patriots, the Ravens, the Minnesota Vikings, the Kansas City Chiefs, they are consistently in this conversation of, hey, we're not going to allow many points. Our defense is going to lock down. And, even with the Kansas City Chiefs kind of having an iffy defense, when they lock down at the back end of the season, they're absolutely just unbelievable. And the amount of productivity they found and the fact that they haven't lost a lot of starters this year, it's looking pretty good for them. Regardless, points allowed, one of these metrics that we wanted to look at. Moving on, another metric we wanted to look at. Yards allowed. Again, bend but don't break. If you're going to let a defense or an offense run all over you or pass all over you, can you at least get your back to the wall, to the end zone, and force them to kick a field goal? And a lot of these teams did. The New England Patriots, of course, another one of these teams at the top because they had a very soft schedule. But regardless, we go ahead and once again see the 49ers, the Bills, the Ravens, and the Steelers as a team that within this top 5 conversation were giving up the fewest amount of points in terms of allowed to opposing offenses, and they weren't given much in terms of total yardage. Good to see. Moving on. Another metric I wanted to point out. And something that, again, is a little difficult to anticipate. Forced overall turnovers last season. The Pittsburgh Steelers and the New England Patriots led this overall metric. But then again, we once again see a lot of teams, 10 of the top 12 defenses in terms of fantasy points last season, are in this conversation and forced the most turnovers last season. And this is where you get to see a little bit of a separation. But once again, you see teams like the New England Patriots, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Minnesota Vikings, the 49ers, the Baltimore Ravens, and the Chiefs, the Bills. They're continuing to show their face in these departments because, yes, overall, if you're going to force the most turnovers, you're probably going to get the most points and have overall success. But if your team does not have ball hawks, how are you going to find these points? It's a matter of consistency over time and being able to produce at a high level and force these turnovers to be trusted enough going forward to at least be drafted. Moving on, quarterback sacks. We have the Pittsburgh Steelers on the top once again last season. And then we also have every other subsequent team. I mean, to be honest, 9 of the top 12 of the regular group has been shown once again. The Carolina Panthers, interestingly enough, they got after the quarterback, the Washington football team, and the Jacksonville Jaguars had themselves quite the pass rush. Washington football team, they bring in the second overall pick of this draft. I mean, he's bringing an extra oomph to their pass rush on top of that. But regardless, another stat to look at, another correlation to see. We're beginning to kind of stack it up for some of these teams as they're pretty much at the top of every single defensive category from last season. Moving on. Touchdowns. Now, touchdowns, like I've mentioned before, in every single fantasy aspect are the most difficult metrics to anticipate and or predict on a weekly basis. And that's why when, in fact, your defense has a bunch of ball hawks and a bunch of playmakers, it's going to eventually lead to touchdowns, whether it's on a return interception, forced fumble recovery for scoop and score, or even a kick or punt return. Ultimately, these teams, again, 10 out of the top 12 teams are at the top of this list because they're on a weekly basis scoring, whether it's special teams or defensively, because, again, they got those playmakers to end up forcing turnovers and being able to execute on it. Regardless, as we've seen throughout this entire video, there's been a couple teams that have kind of been on the top of everything last season. And I kind of wanted to mention that, yes, though they were successful last season, it does not mean that it's going to 100% contribute into their it's not going to contribute to their ultimate success this upcoming season. But regardless, the whole point is, I think consistency is a metric that we have to look at, and consistency over time has kind of been the staple for fantasy defenses and some of these defenses that we talked about. Again, when you're going to be a top 12 defense for the last 5 seasons, that in itself gives me enough confidence to kind of invest in you. But the defenses that I kind of wanted to rank in terms of who I'm potentially going after this upcoming season. Number one, it's the Pittsburgh Steelers. Again, they have 11 returning defensive starters. They have the best pass rush in terms of PFF grades last season. On top of that, they play against one of the easiest schedules this upcoming season. They play against the Giants, they play against the Broncos, the Bengals twice, the Jaguars, and the Washington football team. And the thing about why I named those teams specifically is because of the fact that those are all very inexperienced quarterbacks. Again, the Giants, the Broncos, the Jags, and the Washington football team all have second-year quarterbacks, while the Bengals have a first-year rookie quarterback who's going to be up against it at times. Joe Burrow might struggle against a strong Pittsburgh Steelers defense and pass rush, which is always a possibility. And that in itself, that's a pretty easy slate of games throughout your regular season. On top of the fact that they're going to always produce regardless, because they're just an ultimately, upper tier proficient defense that has a defensive minded head coach, and they're always going to be able to compete in that aspect. Moving on, the next team that I really like in terms of fantasy defense, the San Francisco 49ers, bringing back 11 starters. The only difference is they got rid of DeForest Buckner. They brought in Javon Kinlaw during the draft, pretty much just getting rid of Buckner's his old contract that was going to owe him so much money. You go ahead and get rid of that. You just bring in a rookie. On top of that, in terms of coverage, this is one of the best coverage defenses in the National Football League. When you go ahead and you score out their secondary on top of their linebackers. And again, you have not lost anybody in the secondary or linebacker position. This team is still intact from last season's Super Bowl run. So they will once again be coming out on a revenge tour to try to reprove themselves and get back to the Super Bowl. Moving on. The next team is the Patriots. And though the Patriots were incredible last season, the fact of the matter is that going into this upcoming season, they will not have their entire linebacking core from last year. You're going to be missing Jamie Collins, Kyle Van Noy, Dante Hightower. Those three guys are going to make a huge difference. And sure, they have a great secondary. You have the defensive reigning MVP in Stephon Gilmore. You still have the McCourty brothers. That is all great. But ultimately, if in fact you're not going to have as stable of a linebacking core, it's not going to be as automatic this year for the Patriots. But I do believe in Bill Belichick and their defensive approach. I believe that because of their overall division, the fact that you play against the Bills, the Miami Dolphins, and the Jets, you have 6 easy games there in terms of not allowing very many points on a weekly basis. And that in itself could lead to their ultimate success with an easier schedule per se. Moving on, the next defense I wanted to talk about, the Baltimore Ravens. Like we've already seen, the Baltimore Ravens have been a top 12 defense 4 out of the last 5 seasons. They've continued to be atop of all these different metrics, whether it's points allowed, yards allowed, turnovers, sacks. They're just at the top of every single one of them. But the thing is, they've gone ahead and they've improved their defense this offseason, bringing in Derek Wolfe, bringing in Calais Campbell for a negligible 6th-round pick. You also have Patrick Queen, who you just drafted at LSU, Malik Harrison, who you just drafted, that are going to be your inside backers. I mean, I'm hearing stuff that Patrick Queen is the new Ray Lewis of this offense. You get rid of Earl Thomas, you get rid of the problem there. You still have a monster secondary with Marlon Humphreys and Marcus Peters. And all in all, this is one of the best defenses. Last season, from weeks 10 through 17, the last 8 games of the season, the Baltimore Ravens were the best fantasy defense, the number 1 overall fantasy defense in fantasy points scored. They had a great back end of the season, and hopefully they'll continue that momentum this upcoming year. Just don't play against Derrick Henry, and I think they'll be fine. Moving on, the last defense I wanted to mention, and it was kind of tough to kind of dwindle it down to one defense, because I do think that the Chiefs in this position, could make a viable option, and I'll probably mention them in a little bit, but in terms of what the Vikings are going to do, Mike Zimmer's always been a defensive-minded head coach. He's going to go ahead, and even with losing Everson Griffin and Linval Joseph, they've went in, just the other day, they went and traded for Yannick Ngakoue. He took a pay cut to just join them because the Jacksonville Jaguars are a ticking time bomb, and the organization is literally getting burned to the ground as we speak with all their different decision-making and them trying to tank this year. But regardless, they have a great defense. Sure, their corner position last year was probably their biggest problem, and though they could have potentially improved a little bit better this season, they still have 2 of the best safeties in the National Football League, some of the best coverage linebackers, great pass rush and interior defensive line. And ultimately, again, this is a defensive-minded team and head coach, and they're always going to be consistent there. Again, the honorable mention is 100% going to be the Kansas City Chiefs. Again, they've been a top 12 defense every single season, but they haven't been the top defense. They haven't really been in that conversation. But ultimately, when we go and we look at what the Kansas City Chiefs have kind of lost this offseason, The only thing they basically lost was cornerback. And that's going to play a pretty big difference. When you lose, was it Kyle Fuller? And you lose Rashad Breeland, those are two great corners. And if, you're not going to be able to replace them with, I guess an eligible cornerback that's just as good as them, it's probably going to be a little bit difficult out the gate. The Chiefs have always struggled against the run. If you go ahead and add the fact that they're going to struggle against a potential pass threat on top of that, I mean, it could fall apart, but they always seem to force turnovers, score touchdowns, get sacks, and are overall a pretty good defense, especially when Patrick Mahomes is scoring on three plays, and then the offense on the other side of the ball has to come out and score, and they end up 3-and-outing themselves. The demoralization, the momentum starts to take over regardless. Those are the top defenses. Now, what do you do with those top defenses? At this moment in time, I'm not saying to reach for these defenses. Please don't go out and draft a defense prematurely. I don't want to see any 8th, 9th round picks at the defensive position, even 10th round. Personally, if you take my approach, and a lot of you have seen it over the last couple of years and or draft guides or mock drafts that I've done on the channel, I typically try to avoid a defense and I want to play matchups. But if in fact you're going to go and focus on a defense, these are the guys to go after because they have been the most consistent, have the best defenses as of this moment in time in terms of overall structure, productivity, and comfort within one another. And I think these guys can definitely be relied upon. Either way, thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate the continued support. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like today's video, click that button. I really do appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.